I'm George Jackson, executive producer of GovExec TV and host of this season of the Federal Innovator podcast. The U.S. has always been home to innovators, disruptors, and doers who change how the world works and lives. That's why Accenture Federal Services and GovExec's Studio 2G are coming together for this series of in-depth discussions on what's next in tech, what leaders need to know, and how agencies can prepare their people to thrive. So what do you need to know now? New technologies are converging at breakneck pace and will transform how we experience both our physical and digital lives. 4 key trends are powering this shift: advancements in digital identity, data architectures, generative artificial intelligence models, and science and technology, according to Accenture's 2023 Federal Technology Vision. And government can take steps now to harness these shifts and accelerate greater mission outcomes. You'll walk away from this season with a deeper understanding of how to best harness these emerging technologies and apply insights from real-life use cases to deliver on mission and empower people in new ways to stay on the forefront of change. Stay tuned for our first episode, starting right now.
New technologies like AI, advanced analytics, high-performance computers, quantum computing, and more are causing the physical and digital worlds to merge. This convergence is creating an increasingly interconnected working environment where government decision makers can deliver on their missions at speed and scale. I'm your host, Mike Thieme, Managing Director in the National Security Portfolio at Accenture Federal Services.
And I'm your co-host, George Jackson, Vice President of Events at GovExec. Today, we have 2 experts here to examine how these advancements in technology are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in scientific research and the federal government's unique opportunity in this space as one of the nation's R&D leaders.
I'd like to welcome Jill Marlowe, who's a Digital Transformation Officer for NASA, where she works to conceive, architect, and accelerate digital solutions that allow the agency to achieve bolder missions faster and more affordably than ever before.
I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. We're also joined by Jerome Fineman, who serves as the lead value architect and deputy practice lead for federal sustainability from Accenture Federal Services. Welcome, Jerome.
Looking forward to the conversation.
So let's jump in. This is a question for both Jill and Jerome, and just to kind of set the table for us. So how has the federal government's role in scientific R&D changed over time?
Yeah, so I can lead off if you want.
Yes.
I spent probably the first 30-some years of my career out at a federal lab. I was at the Langley Research Center within NASA and leading a variety of different research. So obviously this is a topic near and dear to my heart. One of the things that I love, actually, is that NASA, before that, was the NACA, the National Advisory Committee in Aeronautics. And back in 1915, they laid out the purpose of government in R&D. And I wish I could come up with words that stood the test of time over 100 years. But what they said was the government's role is to supervise and direct the problems of flight with a view to their practical solution. And I'm like, right there it is. What are the problems that we really need to be solving, and how can we start to accelerate going toward that practical solution? So that's really, I think, what the government's role is. You see that reflected at NASA with trying to lay in an agenda for, like, where are we going to go from a human spaceflight perspective? What are those problems that we ought to be, solving from a societal perspective? And then how can we work with the ecosystem, the aerospace ecosystem, to really get to those practical ways of solving those and delivering those missions?
That's super helpful. So, even though it was over 100 years ago, it's still like serving for essentially a future-looking mission from an S&D perspective.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's just beautiful.
It's really elegant. So Jerome, what's your point of view on that?
Yeah, so I think I have a little bit, I think the addition to that is I really see it breaking into about 4 different roles. First is really thinking about that implementer point of view, right? So as Jill just talked about, how can NASA make that material impact on spaceflight mission, et cetera? I think there's other ways that they're doing this as well. Another as an investment, as an investor. It's clear that through policy that's happened over the last year with IIJ, et cetera, and we can, sure touch on that a little bit more in the future around putting significant amount of money into progressing research and development in specific areas. There's the obvious regulation that they do, right? So if you think about the FDA or other bodies around energy and FERC, et cetera, how are they thinking about these industries and the policies and regulations that need to be there as well? And then really as that convener, right? I think there's a lot of work that the federal government does where they are convening, the best and brightest within the federal government with industry leaders as well. And so how do they start facilitating and building those relationships to move research and development and, mission and the impact that it can have on, the globe and the citizens?
Jill, it raises an interesting point. IIJ, there's also the CHIPS Act, but funding for some of those mechanisms has not reached fruition. From the agency level, is there almost a groundswell or a realization that this increased or renewed focus on R&D is coming and we need to start innovating to get things in place?
Yeah, I would say that we certainly welcome all of that investment that kind of shows up as incentive, right?
Right.
So we get a lot of private sector. And so, laying some of the groundwork to help those industries come along so that we can get those technologies to the point where we can capitalize on them and sort of trying to anticipate when those breakthroughs are going to be able to be things that we can incorporate into mission. And especially for NASA, right? It's a lot of those tech, but we got to harden them for the environment of air and space. So there's a little bit more runway ahead of us before we can go and put them on board a NASA mission. And so trying to kind of converge, when is all of that investment, and amen, Jerome, on what you said about the role of government there and incentivizing all of that. But when is that actually going to show up so that we can start to infuse that into the missions? That's probably where the hearts and minds are of the NASA folk right now.
And by no way am I suggesting that innovation is just waiting, sitting on its thumbs at NASA there. Jerome, I do want to introduce a phrase that we talked about before we went on the air here, the science technology feedback loop. What does that mean? What does it have to do with R&D?
Yeah, I would really think that as sort of the mutual influence that science and technology have on one another at this point, especially as you look at advancement of technologies and of science. I think if you look at, the mission of NASA, I think is a great example where, I'm kind of hearkening back a little bit to, the space race and that shift that NASA had between, human computers to the implementation and development of, IBM's first computer, and how that influenced and helped expedite and speed up the pace at which they could do, mathematical calculations. I think at this point forward, and if you look at AI as it relates to research and development, it's used as, once again, an expediter. You can test hypotheses quicker. You can use AI to pick up on insights that and patterns that the human brain either takes a longer period of time to do or just physically can't do because the sheer amount of numbers and data that is out there. And by doing this, it expedites research by short-circuiting some of those longer-term things. Like I'm harkening back to my days as a battery researcher, where when I was testing a material, I would have to wait a number of days for a battery to fail. Now through modeling and things like that, you can test specific parameters and then use that to influence physical tests. So once again, you're taking out that time needed for exploration and just understanding of physical systems.
Studio crew knows all too well that sensation of waiting for a battery to fail here. Jill, what stood out there for you?
Well, I really resonated with your description of what that feedback loop looks like, right? To me, I think of it as a virtuous cycle, right? We're investing in the technology. The spin-offs that you mentioned from NASA are a great example of that. And then that very technology ends up enabling us to take sort of the next leap in R&D, right? So it just is this continuous feedback feedback loop that turns into a virtuous cycle. So, I'm so focused right now in my current role on digital technologies. I kind of like to shine the lens on how I'm seeing some of those, technologies take off and enable the mission. One of my favorite examples actually is it's kind of motivated by where we're trying to go, right? So NASA's signature mission right now is the Artemis mission. That's where we'll send the first woman, first person of color to the moon, not for flags and footprints reasons, but to establish a sustainable human presence on the moon so that we can learn what is it that we need to be able to do in order to go on to Mars, right? That's the ultimate destination, send humans to Mars. But sending humans to Mars means we got to accomplish R&D barriers that we have never been able to do before. We've landed a metric ton on Mars before, very thin atmosphere, right? Not a lot to slow it down. To get to human scale, it's 10 metric tons. 2-story tall spacecraft screaming into the Martian atmosphere at about 12,000 miles an hour, right? And you need to actually land that thing in a way that humans survive and you're able to go on. So lots of different technologies that we're looking at to try to do that. The physics of that kind of landing, you actually cannot replicate on Earth physically. I mean, there's no test environment that you can actually create. So we're definitely leaning into modeling and simulation. But the complexity of what we're looking at, like for example, one of the technologies we're looking at is what's called supersonic retropropulsion. So you imagine you got your spacecraft coming in and you have little rockets shooting down, right? Trying to basically slow the rocket down or slow the spacecraft down. When you think about what you have to simulate there, it's the aerodynamics coming through the atmosphere, it's the propulsion system, the burn of those rockets. The heat shield that protects the spacecraft is literally physically burning and changing shape, which then in turn changes how it's flying through the atmosphere. So you got to have your control system. So all of those physics have to actually get simulated. And again, you can't test it on Earth, right? So you think about the fidelity to actually be able to do that at human scale when there's a lot of, there's lives on the line. You got to really be able to simulate that. Well, right now, if we were to try to simulate even a small fraction of that, it would actually take us, and this goes back to Jerome's point, like 4.5 years on our current systems to simulate a segment of that, like 4.5 years of runtime on our current CPU-based computing. So we partnered with Oak Ridge National Labs a couple of years ago and started looking at, well, what if we re-architected our codes for GPUs? And guess what I'll let you guess. Guess when we did that, what did that 4.5 years turn into, do you think?
2 years.
Okay, I got a bid for 2 years. What do you think?
Say 2 months.
2 months. What do you say, Jerome?
12 hours.
You're closest. 4 days.
4 days.
4 days. And it was 6 different runs of different configurations. But to Jerome's point, that is such a compression in the learning cycle, right? Mm-hmm. We're actually trying to optimize a spacecraft. It is really hard to land something of that scale on Mars. You're not going to go with the first thing you tried. You really want to be able to hone in on it. So you've got to shrink that learning cycle. That's just the compute part of it. Integrating all of those physics models together with what we can do now with various architectures, interoperable architectures, what we can do with automation of the creating of the models, right? To be able to kind of clean some of that data on the back end, the millions of runs, the amount of terabytes of data that come down from each of those, that's, as you were, I think, pointing out, more data than humans can actually process, right? So all of those kinds of technologies have the effect of shortening the learning cycle, which means we can do a lot more testing virtually through simulation and get the risk out of the mission. And so that increases our probability of success and also the affordability, right? Because you got to factor in all the redundancy.
Right. And so, I feel like Jill and Jerome, you've touched on some of this in the answer about the feedback loop. Where do you feel that this will be most impactful soonest? Like, which research areas are the nearest term problems that might be solved? Thinking about the application of AI to some mission spaces, like what's closest at hand?
Yeah.
What's closest at hand in addition to the big picture?
So it's interesting. We've done a lot on the technical side already. So just getting back to the moon mission, right? So Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter went a few years ago. A lot of imagery came back from that. We've got some robotic precursor missions getting ready to look for landing sites and things like that coming up. And we were able to use machine learning to kind of extract from those very dark images, get all the detector noise out of them, and actually get down to 3-meter resolution in some of those permanently shadowed craters of the moon, where you can't can't optically see what's going on to be able to really kind of eliminate some risk for where we're going to send those robotic missions and be able to land and plan traverse, right? Because we're going up there to kind of suss that out. So we've done things like that already. We have an AI model that we sent up to station that's actually doing glove inspection. So every time an astronaut goes out on EVA, they're constantly taking imagery and looking for cracks, defects in the gloves that would put their lives at risk, right? Those images right now get sent down to a ground station, and people review those. It takes multiple people, multiple days. Sent an AI model up, trained it on the images. It was able to return a go, no-go recommendation in 45 seconds. So we're seeing places like that where we're bringing it in. Reverse design of materials, where you actually start with, where do we need to end the design? And you can kind of architect back in, well, how can I create a compound or a composite layup or something like that, right? All of that kind of work. We've done some prototype work there, and there are several other examples. But I will tell you, from a practical, scalable perspective, I think where we're seeing the opportunity to really push further is on what I would call the R&D support side, right? So there's a lot of work to do R&D that is in procurements, right? It is, we all are in meetings. We have documents that we need to produce and summarize, right? So, we're looking at things like large language models to do meeting or document summaries for us. We're looking at, I actually just am closing, I think it's next week, on a crowdsourced competition for an AI research assistant, where we're trying to look at, is there a way for an AI digital assistant to help our researchers scan the plethora of technical literature that's coming out on a daily basis, right? And ingest that so that we can put it to use on NASA's mission. Right. And there's plenty more.
It's a problem we're hearing across our client base. It's at the top of everyone's mind. I wonder if, Jerome, you wanted to piggyback on this with anything that you're seeing in your space.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to just touch on what you were saying. When it comes to sort of a little bit of the differences that you see in some of the classic methods and AI-driven methods, right? Just harkening back to, once again, my grad school days, where I started whatever project I started on, I did a lit scan, right? So imagine if I had an AI model that I could type in the parameters, the things that I'm trying to look for, and then boom, it's sort of like, here's the 20 articles that are most relevant, here's the citations, here's the summaries, here's the key findings, right? That type of thing is possible now to sort of just jumpstart, where's my starting point in research, right? When it comes to sort of the applications, even on a physical layer, thinking about some of the systems and, energy management and grid management, a lot around optimization is already being done out there in the world, right? And I know Department of Energy is, really big into and sort of pushing the ideas of virtual power plants, much of which is sort of through AI-driven optimization. If you're thinking about other things around siting or anything like that, use of AI through computer vision or other types of technologies that really help you look at a geographic area and determine with multiple parameters, where's the best place to put this particular energy production plant, right? Is it wind, solar? How's it going to integrate into the grid, et cetera? And then, I think from the federal government's point of view, especially when it comes to sort of understanding climate change and the potential risks, right? So all that understanding of climate change and the predictive modeling of where might be most impacted and where, FEMA might need to start considering, ready hubs or things like that. These are all just kind of like really tactical places that the federal government has already put investment and time into doing.
So Jerome, let me piggyback on that. And I think you touched on it in a couple of the examples you gave, but can you just give us a couple of examples of the way that the federal approach differs from that in commercial? Like, what are you seeing in the commercial space? It's either complementary or maybe additive to what's going on in federal.
Yeah, so I think, as going back up to that part of our conversation where it was talking about the investment that the federal government has been putting behind it, I think there's a big emphasis on this idea of translational research, right? I think for a long time, the federal government has been fairly focused on foundational R&D. The scale at which this money is being deployed is really thinking about how do we take things out of the lab and then make it useful as a commercial product, right? So with that in mind, the industry is a lot of the time looking for more shorter term goals, right? And being able to generate revenue. How are they turning a product into something that's commercially viable, right? I think the federal government a lot of the time has that ability to look at those particular areas that aren't getting quite enough research input into, and being able to sort of unleash the scale and capabilities of their research institutions on those. It's a lot more mission oriented, right? I think it's, as I said, sort of looking at how to de-risk certain research and development activities for the industry then to sort of take and, either implement at scale or commercialize, right? And then really thinking about how the federal government's research and development base is developing more of a national strategy on how to prioritize key research areas and key resources.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So it sounds like they are complementary, both with a sense of urgency, but addressing the same sort of macro goal. So that's really useful. Thanks, Jerome.
Can I hop in on something that you said, Jerome?
Yeah.
So when you were talking about translational research, that really resonated with me. And coming at it from the perspective of, we are seeing advances across all kinds of market sectors, and they can impact any number of federal government, missions, and frankly, things that citizens care about, right? So I think that the government now has this responsibility to essentially be hyper-connected, to kind of constantly be scanning across different sectors. Like, I can't just pay attention to aerospace anymore, right? Some of these advances in AI, they didn't come from us, right? So how are we going to ingest in all of those different technologies, really have the discernment to figure out, well, what could make that difference, and sort the hype from the from the reality of what is the practical things that we're going to have to do to actually take this one and implement it in some kind of solution. But moreover, your comment on translational research triggered this for me. I think it's all about the federal government can play a huge role in technology convergence, right? So bringing different things together that actually there's a breakthrough if we take this, this technology from this market sector, marry it up with another one and harden it for our various responsible, missions across federal government. This could actually be the thing that pushes us forward. So I see that technology convergence role being huge, and it maybe goes back to some of the investment questions that you were asking earlier on.
Well, I have one more.
Yeah.
It's the last one. Jill, Jerome, it's for both of you, and it's along the lines of tangible next steps. We've covered a ton of ground.
We have,
for agencies, for organizations that really want to start taking advantage of R&D in these emerging areas. What should they do first, second, third, Jill?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you sort of two takes on that response, right? One is more practical, like you've actually got to get some of this tech in and start leaning into it and experimenting with it. So like, for example, right now we have a whole internal partnership going on where we're testing large language models with non-sensitive public data, but really trying to get our workforce smart about, what can they do? What are the limits of what they can do? What are the use cases? We're looking at chat, we're looking at code, we're looking at image development, right? Like you got to actually, we need to take responsibility for that. But I will say the other thing is I'm a big proponent of begin with the end in mind. So I think we need to take responsibility for where do government services need to go? Like, for example, what does the NASA of 2040 need to look like? What is the public going to be asking of us then? What's our role? We have angel investors and all kinds of things happening in the aerospace marketplace right now. So what is NASA's role? And then how do we actually transform to become that NASA that the public is going to demand us to be? There's a certain amount of, we got to get on the same page organizationally under the hood of NASA, right? We actually have to start to have a common view of that future. And then each organization has to kind of say, okay, here's my piece of that. Here's how I would lay in plans and start to really line up our internal investments against how we would get there. And so frankly, that's what our digital transformation initiative that I lead is aspiring to do, is to sort of shine a light on, let's get crisp on these transformation targets, we call them, where we need to actually transform NASA. And let's get clear on what are those high high payoff digital approaches that we really want to push across organizations and lay in the internal action plans to get there. So for us, it's less about getting people comfortable with technology. We're sort of a technology hugging agency, if you will, but it's more about how do we actually get people to aim in the same direction so that it turns into practical progress, right?
Jerome, over to you. Tangible next steps, sir.
Yeah, I think, we can kind of relate back to some of those roles that I established at the very beginning, right? I think tactical next steps as, an investor, right, is really sort of leaning into that funding that's being out there, but also provide focus to where that funding needs to go. I think as an implementer, right, that sort of, as Jill said, getting to start using this technology, right? So they need to build and invest in the infrastructure for themselves to actually start actioning with it and doing research with these new emerging technologies. I think as that convener, Jill also talked about that convergence, right? I think there's also the idea of promoting public and private partnerships, right? So how do we not just look at ourselves as a technology convener or convergence of technology, but how do we start really building those relationships and a feedback loop between government and industry itself? And then I think as a regulator, right, there's a lot. There's a lot of potential with this new technology. I think if we don't start thinking about some of those guardrails and approaches to ensuring that these are implemented in a safe, equitable, and inclusive way for everybody, you're also sort of missing the boat on really the potential of what these technologies can bring both to government and then also, to society as a whole.
Well, Jerome, great place to leave it. That was Jerome Fineman. He serves as Lead Value Architect and Deputy Practice Lead for Federal Sustainability at Accenture Federal Services. Jerome, thanks.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
And here in studio with us, Jill Marlowe, Digital Transformation Officer at NASA. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to the listeners of this podcast. This episode is produced by GovExec and sponsored by Accenture Federal Services. For more information about how your agency can leverage advanced technology in R&D, visit www.accenturefederal.com.